the current president and the president-elect, so it's a 3-year term.
Hi, everyone.
what
Just
we
joining
try
you
to do
live
is
this afternoon
continue
for the
to,
DEP
disseminate
defamation
best
trial.
practices in
Sounds like they are
psychology and
bringing
also
on here.
interface
This
with
is
the
Julie Stoll,
larger
by the way,
American
from Restore
Psychological
Hope Therapy,
Association
psychotherapist
organization
here in
to
Canada.
continue to disseminate
Qualified,
best practices
been a
and have
counselor,
just a
psychotherapist,
voice
therapist for
for
the
trauma
last 17
psychology,
years.
with our larger body.
I'm just
and
trying to catch up
policy.
here on who's talking.
I've been
here.
involved in the trauma psychology executive
Something to do with the
board,
Psychological
since its
Association.
inception. I
I'm
was a
assuming they're
founding
going to be
member of
trying to
that
prove
division.
the fact that
I
Amber
served
Heard
as
has
a membership
PTSD
chair,
from
a
Johnny Depp.
program chair, an awards chair. I was the APA Council of Representatives, which means I was also elected to serve a 3-year term and sit on the governance board of APA, representing the Division of Trauma Psychology. So I've been very actively involved in the trauma division.
Okay, but what's your
What is
training?
the Division of Trauma Psychology?
What's your
So
training?
the
What's your
Division of Trauma
education?
Psychology are psychologists who come together, who
listen.
want to
Sorry, I keep
disseminate best practices in trauma psychology. We want to make sure that we have our finger on the pulse of research and evidence-based interventions for people who are struggling with traumatic events that have happened to them.
And we
Have
do
you
know that
served in leadership
Amber had a
positions
lot
in
of
other
traumatic
professional
events happen
organizations?
before this relationship, just to know.
Yes, I was, there's a New York
Let me turn this
City-based
down a little bit
organization.
here.
It's called the Women's Mental Health Consortium, and that's also an interdisciplinary organization.
Sorry, guys, I thought it was on
Psychology,
there.
psychiatry, nursing,
Apologies.
social work. And this was formed in order to give women sort of a referral base and more information about mostly like reproductive psychiatry. We know that certain difficulties and psychological
difficulties that you have can erupt when you're pregnant or postpartum. So we wanted to have a number of resources available to women in the New York City area. I was a membership chair there for a number of years, and then I was the president of that organization, I think 2009 to 2017. I don't have my CV, but I think that's about right.
Why is participation in professional organizations important in your field?
Well, it's important to me because I do believe very much in service. I do believe very much in giving back. I do believe that it's important as a psychologist who believes strongly in trauma psychology.
Okay, she's a psychologist.
I can be part of the voice at the table, part of that.
It'd be interesting to hear what her, if she, I don't know if she assessed Amber Heard as well, but
To make sure that
the other
people are getting,
psychologist that
appropriate
already
care that they
testified
deserve.
was
So it's something
very
that, this has
competent,
always been part of my
and
life in varying degrees, and as a psychologist, I feel like
her
it's a, you know,
diagnoses were
rewarding,
very
part of
convincing
my job.
and
Do you
very
attend
thorough.
professional conferences?
Yes, I do, typically multiple times a year. Of course, COVID threw a little bit of a wrench in that.
PTSD is a lot
Some
harder
things
to
are virtual,
diagnose
but
and
yes,
is
I
the
do
easiest,
attend
like the other
outreach.
psychologist said, the easiest to fake.
And why do you think that's important?
It's important to stay abreast of developments in the field. It's important to meet with
your colleagues across the country and see what they're doing and what they're hearing and what's working and what's not working. So when you're at a conference and somebody's presenting new or novel research, then you can take that information and bring that back to your clients and bring that back to my forensic work. So it absolutely enhances the work that I do.
Have you ever been qualified to testify in the field of psychology as an expert witness?
Yes, I have.
How many times?
I was first qualified in 1998, so since then, about 50 times.
And how often in that 50 times has the specialty been in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress?
Probably more than half.
Okay. Have you ever worked for or testified for the prosecution in criminal matters, like the District Attorney's Office, U.S. Attorney's Office?
Yes, I have, frequently.
Okay. Do you testify for both sides in lawsuits, plaintiffs and defendants?
Yes, I do.
Both sides in lawsuits, plaintiffs and defendants?
Yes, I do.
Have you ever worked on other cases that didn't go to trial?
Many.
Okay. Have you ever found an individual that you evaluated did not suffer from the effects of interpersonal violence or PTSD?
frequently.
Okay, so this is Dr. Dawn
Have you ever
Hughes.
not been qualified?
I'm not sure if they said Michigan.
Been
Looking at a Google
to
review here on
qualify
Dr. Dawn Hughes, MD,
No.
severe feminist, and
Your
it
Honor, I would
shows
at
she
this
was given a
time
1
move to
star out of 5.
qualify
So she's
Dr.
a
Hughes
severe
as an
feminist,
expert
according to
forensic
this
psychologist
prior
with
client.
specialization in interpersonal
So she's
violence
going to
and
be
traumatic stress.
Any objection?
extremely
No objection to qualifying her as an expert in forensic psychology.
more specifically forensic psychology with a specialization in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress.
Any objection?
No.
All right, so moved.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Hughes, please tell the jury what domestic violence, intimate partner violence means.
Sure. So I'm probably going to be interchanging the language domestic violence and interpersonal violence, and for purposes here, these are the same thing. So intimate partner violence is a pattern of manipulation, fear, and coercive control that happens within an intimate relationship. It constitutes using a variety of abusive behaviors, and that can be physical violence, sexual violence, psychological aggression, emotional abuse, stalking or surveillance behaviors, and economic abuse. The abusive behaviors occur over time, not all at once, and they're also interspersed with very normal times, times without violence, times with love and happiness, and it's this interpositioning of the violence with the love and the abuse, with the love and the care, that makes it very difficult for a victim to extricate herself from that situation and from that relationship.
And what would you say is the overarching dynamic of these relationships?
So the overarching dynamic is the abuse of power and control of one person wanting to have dominance in that relationship, say over most things that the couple or that the victim does or does not do.
My apologies. What I stated earlier with the review is not, I don't think it's the same person as this one, so my bad.
The goal of it is to establish dominance.
What coercive control does is that it imposes negative consequences for noncompliance with your partner's expectations or demands.
And what that does is
Oh,
it
you mean like
erodes
her
away
yelling
at
couch,
the
couch,
victim's
couch,
autonomy
couch until
and
she
her
gets her way?
independence.
Yeah, that sounds like abusive,
What is
definitely.
physical violence?
So physical violence is when one person uses their body against the body of another with the intent to cause injury or harm. That can be push, shove, slap, kick, punch, beat up, meaning multiple types of physicality in one instance, throw, slam into a wall, push into something hard that you could hurt yourself. Clearly, use of a weapon would be a physically violent act as well.
Does size and strength matter between the parties?
Yes, very much so. This is very well documented in the literature about violence and abuse in relationships, and that's just physics. That's just proportional force. That if a 185-pound man is going to push a 120-pound woman, that's going to feel quite different than a 120-pound woman pushing a 185-pound man. And it's just about proportional force and the size and strength differential. And that is why specifically, if you look at wrestling or boxing, they match weight classes. And they do that for a reason, because they know that it's not fair if somebody is bigger and stronger than the other. So it's certainly not the only factor, but it is a factor that one has to consider if a relationship is violent.
What is psychological aggression?
So psychological aggression is threats and the imposition of threats with the intent to control someone's behavior. So it's doing a threat so that you will modify your behavior and do what your partner wants. Some psychological aggression techniques are intimidation. Slamming
Yep,
your
and it's
hand
also
on
threatening
on a table,
suicide.
Punching a wall, throwing
Um,
something,
mumbling
under your mouth,
cursing,
cursing.
screaming, sort of these high emotional balance type of activities that can cause a victim to feel afraid and feel intimidated. And then if there has been an act of physical violence where that contingency has already been established, that this person, your partner, has said, okay, I not only have the ability to use violence against you, I also have the willingness to do it. The intimidating tactics take on greater flavor. They take on greater salience. They mean more because you know what could be coming down the pike.
What is emotional abuse?
So emotional abuse functions to denigrate a person's sense of self-worth and their self-perception. It's about name-calling, being very mean-spirited, putting yourself down, using gender-based language that's offensive, racial slurs, all types of behaviors to really make a person feel less than they actually should.
And what is sexual abuse?
So sexual abuse in an intimate relationship functions to establish dominance and establish power. What it is simply in the psychological and psychiatric communities is forcing someone to do something sexual against your will when you did not want to. It can be forced sex, either forced vaginal, oral, anal sex. It can be forced to engage in any other type of sexual act that you may not want to do. And when I say force, it doesn't mean it has to have physical force. There's a lot of psychologically coercive tactics that are used that many times when violence has already been established in the relationship, the victim often feels that she can't say no for fear of reprisal, for fear of retaliation, for saying no to those acts. So sexual abuse, does happen in intimate partner relationships. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, and they don't want to ask about it because it makes people very uncomfortable.
Is digital penetration of the vagina sexual abuse?
Action leading.
What, if any, role does digital penetration of the vagina play in sexual abuse?
She just said that.
If it is non-consensual, then it is abusive.
What, if any, penetration of inanimate objects into the vagina plays a role in sexual abuse?
Again, the operative word is consensual. If you are not consenting to those acts, then it is sexually abusive.
Is there a distinction between sexual violence and sexual abuse?
Not really. Sexual violence is a term of art. It is the overarching umbrella that we in the psychological and psychiatric communities talk about.
So if we are looking
I'm
at
just
our
smiling a little bit because of the
diagnostic
way
and
that this
statistical
lawyer is
manual
asking these
and say,
questions.
what are the traumas that could cause PTSD? It's listed as sexual violence.
So it's an umbrella term that allows us to understand it could be childhood sexual abuse, it could be a rape, a sexual assault, it can be sexual abuse in an intimate relationship. So it's really just an overarching term.
It's a really hard thing to prove too, because it's just one word or the other,
So it
over
doesn't
the
mean,
other.
I think people often mistake it to mean that when you are being sexually abused, that someone's punching you or someone's hitting you or someone's doing something like that because you hear the violence. It does not mean that. That could happen, but that term does not require that, nor does it mean that.
What are stalking or surveillance behaviors?
So stalking and surveillance behaviors are a common tactic of typically men who use violent behaviors in an intimate relationship. What they do is they allow the woman to know that wherever she is, wherever she goes, he's going to know. I'm going to maybe look at your phone, see who you're talking to, track you on Find My iPhone, look at your Instagram, look at your emails, really having a way of knowing all of the personal information about you. And what that does, it again erodes the victim's autonomy and it erodes her sense of privacy. She doesn't feel that wherever she can go, that somewhere he's not going to be.
Why is it she just saying she? This can happen both ways.
Way. Sometimes there's the pop-ins of show up at places that they're not supposed to be and that we don't want them to be, just as a way of checking. Sometimes they'll have
This goes
friends
both
or
ways
family
though.
check up on their partners to make sure
Absolutely.
where they are. What time did you get
Both
home?
ways.
But you didn't turn off your phone at this time, but you came in the door
this time. Like all of the sort of constant questioning and interrogation about an individual's whereabouts.
What about economic abuse? What is that?
So economic abuse is a way to, again, continue to maintain control over your intimate partner. Sometimes it's withholding information about the finances, of not letting you have access to the finances. If you can't have access to a credit card or a checking account or, Apple Pay on your phone, then you're rendered usually much more economically dependent on your partner, and that limits tangible options for you. For individuals where that sort of tangible options isn't there, we see the economic abuse or the economic restriction when one partner refuses to share any information about the funds. So it's not like I can't go shopping because I won't have money, but I don't have any decision-making in our family money. I don't have any idea of what we're doing in our family vis-a-vis our finances. So it's a way of definitely keeping that very separate and not in a consensual. Some couples make that choice. One person does all the money, that's fine. But when it doesn't come from a place of consensual choice-making, it can be abusive.
So you just described a number of these abusive behaviors. Are all of them present in every domestic violence relationship?
Right. No, they're not all present in everyone. And that's why it's very important to do a thorough assessment of a relationship that may be mired in violence to see which ones are present and which ones have a great impact in the relationship, which ones are sort of making the structure of this relationship.
After a sexual assault in an intimate relationship, how might a victim in those circumstances interact with her partner?
So this is one of the myths that people say, well, if she was sexually assaulted by her partner, she would have just left. And nothing could be further from the truth. That's not what happens.
Especially when it's your.
I don't
your
like that she's
husband or your
just saying
boyfriend or your
she, because it
partner.
can go both ways.
So what women do is they bury it.
They
They compartmentalize it. They
Women,
put it
what
away.
women
They
do.
avoid it.
Okay,
because
honey.
Then they continue to reach out for the
Um,
kind and
This
the
is
loving
exactly
man
what
that
it
they
sounds
got
like Johnny
into this
Depp did though as
relationship
well
with.
in this
The
relationship.
problem is that it
It sounds like there was
fester
definitely
belief and
sounds
causes
like
more
verbal
sort of
abuse going both
psychological
ways. And
distress in the victim.
it got repaired
What if
temporarily and then they
shame or
got
humiliation
abusive with
play
each other
in this
again and then
coercive dynamic?
they both
So
buried it.
that's one of the emotions that the victim is usually trying to suppress and compartmentalize and avoid and put away. One of the most frequently felt feelings after something so incredibly humiliating and violating is shame. And shame is a very sort of difficult emotion for people to have to live with and to have to experience. And then a lot of times what we see in these relationships, especially ones where sexual assault is perpetrated, there's typically the emotional abuse as well. So now if you're called names like a whore and a slut and easy and fat, and you're feeling the shame from the sexual assault that just happened, it sort of acts as a compounding effect, and it sort of kind of slowly deteriorates the psychological functioning of the victim, and where they're just really trying to get back to the good guy, get the good guy to come back, but they're suffering these symptoms underneath.
What about intimidation? What role does intimidation play in the coercive control dynamic?
And intimidation is one of the huge factors that we see in coercive control. Again, the goal is to get your partner to do what you want them to do. And if you've established that you can use violence and other sexual violence and physical violence, slamming
your hand on the table, throwing a glass, breaking a door, throwing anything.
I'm
causing
hearing
fit,
a lot
yelling
of
and
Amber
screaming.
Heard doing that in the
can rise
relationship.
the fear level in a victim.
A lot of
that she may
demanding
modify
and
her behavior quicker, and he might not need
victimhood in
use
order to
physical
control as
violence
well. So I
because
just,
he's already
I think it's
established
important to
that
balance
fear
out the
is there.
conversation. Yeah, we definitely saw a video of Johnny Depp slamming around, being very intimidating for who knows what reason, but I
Objection
think
leading.
it's equally coercive and controlling and potentially abusive.
I mean, certainly writing obscene messages to your partner.
Grabbing
could absolutely be
a group of friends every time you get into an argument
What
with
if
your
he rolls
partner
his
and playing the
emotional abuse
victim
or
and
degradation?
calling a nurse and sending
So
emotional
pictures
abuse and
and
degradation,
as
Yeah.
I stated before, functions to decrease your sense of self-worth. It decreases your sense of agency. It makes you feel bad about yourself. And when you feel bad about yourself, you're less likely to actualize and see options for leaving. You're so sort of mired in this dynamic of abuse that you come sometimes to believe the bad things that the person is telling you about. So, maybe I am not talented and fat and lazy and stupid, and it interferes with that ability to problem solve and figure out, can I get out of this relationship? And sometimes you feel you don't even deserve to get out of the relationship when the abuse is so chronic and so repetitive.
What role does surveillance as a means of control play in that dynamic?
So surveillance.
Objection leading.
I don't think that's leading, Your Honor.
Overruled, go ahead.
So surveillance functions to let the victim know wherever you are, there I am. So it makes her feel not secure in her movement, feeling that she has to restrict her movement. Her movement is not hers alone. It usually increases hypervigilance, it increases fear, it increases the need for yourself to mark where you've been and what you've done so that you can go back and prove it to your partner, because you know that there is going to be an interrogation later. When this pattern has been established, show receipts, show me your iPhone, where were you, what's your Google location at? Those are some types of surveillance behaviors that puts the victim very much on edge and increases that level of anxiety and trepidation.
What role does possessive jealousy play in these relationships?
So possessive jealousy is a very difficult dynamic in intimate partner violence. It's very common in situations of coercive control. It's rooted in possession, that the gentleman feels that he can possess her and that he can have her whenever he wants. It's very possessive dynamic. But the accusations, the problem is when you make the accusations, the woman's forced to refute the accusations. So they're continuing in this dynamic where she's trying to prove, I didn't do what you said, this didn't happen. And then unfortunately, sometimes it escalates because the man is not taking the no for an answer, because this is a perseverative obsessive pattern that's very difficult to penetrate, that often these type of conversations lend themselves to physical and sexual violence.
Does this dynamic happen overnight?
No, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over time. We don't, a woman doesn't get into a relationship with a man who's beating her up and sexually assaulting her and calling her names and doing all that. She gets into the relationships for all the right reasons, just like we all get into relationships, for love, for companionship, for kindness, for a future. But then slowly, all of these behaviors start to take form. And I always say it's sort of like sucking the oxygen out of the room, and then before you know it, you're suffocating.
So, and that brings me to my next question. What role do physical abuse and coercive tactics play interspersed with normalcy and positive moments?
Objection compound.
A sustained objection.
Okay. I'll figure this out some way. What role does love and normalcy play in these dynamics you've been describing?
Objection compound.
Overruled.
Thank you.
So love and normalcy are almost always in these relationships, that, when you are in a lull and the violence is not happening, you're back to sort of the loving man that you wanted, the person who you wanted to be with. And when you pair sort of this violent dynamic, physical violence, sexual violence, with love and attachment, it creates a trauma bond. It creates a psychological bond. An emotional dependency is created.
So it makes it very
It is very
difficult
true.
for
It does create a
the
trauma
victim
bond
of
both
the
ways,
abuse
though,
to sort of
not just for
extricate
for
herself
women as
from
victims.
that
I'm sorry,
relationship.
but
And
And for her to even believe,
Um,
frankly,
in
in
that
that
you can
case,
tell
a lot
who
of times
hired
to
this
believe
person.
that
that
she
she
can,
can,
and that she should.
He or she, honey,
And what if any role does that dynamic you've described
he or she
have
or
in
they.
the victim thinking they can fix the problem?
Very
So
common.
what do we know from the research?
The research with working with battered men who come into treatment is that the only person who can change the abuse is the abuser. So no matter what the tactics that the woman uses, she's trying to do all these different things to fix him, to have him not be violent, to have him not be sexually violent, to have him not be obsessively jealous. And all those things don't change his behavior, because it's up to him to change his behavior. And this was played out a million times in the batterers intervention groups that I led. And the men would tell us, it doesn't matter what she does. I don't care. So the problem is that the woman continues to think that she can fix it, and yet she can't. But she's the one who's then rendered sort of helpless and hopeless because everything that she's trying to do is failing.
What is the cycle of violence?
So the cycle of violence is one way to describe this domestic violence pattern. Typically what we see, and the cycle can be different in a variety of relationships, but typically what we see is in the first phase, so sort of multiple 3 to 4 phases. In the first phase, there's a tension building phase. you're sort of starting to feel that apprehension. He may be throwing his papers on the table a little more. He may be slamming the fridge door a little more. He may be mumbling under his mouth a little more. He may grab a glass a little more forcefully than he normally is.
Wow.
Then there's the blow up, or the violence, the abuse, the screaming, the sexual.
Really
violence, the
alluding to
physical
that
violence,
video, eh?
All that occurs. Then we come to the contrition phase. I'm sorry.
I
I didn't mean it.
It wasn't me. I'm not going to do it again. The promises for change. And then we sort of slide into the calm phase where, you know, this isn't going to happen again. I'm back to stable ground. I want to live in this place, this sort of honeymoon place. You know, the problem in the calm phase is we often see the rationalizations and the justifications for the behavior. It's not like typically the man is taking full responsibility for what he did, but it's calm because there's no, you know.
So I just want to clarify here, because this woman is doing a very poor job of making it equal conversation, that intimate partner violence, a woman can be equally as abusive sexually and all the other things that she stated as a man, and it can be happening mutually by both parties, not just a woman being abused by a man. Okay, honey.
Love bomb mean?
So the love bombing is, it's more of the colloquial term for the younger folks here, but, you know, where you shower someone with affection and love, you know, in this contrition and calm phase where, you know, everything about you is special. You're the best thing in the world. I'm never going to do anything to hurt you again. I would never let anyone hurt you. And it could be sending flowers and buying gifts or going on trips or your favorite restaurant. And that is, you know, a way of where the man is trying to make those amends. And then it gets the woman hooked. So they get hooked on the kindness. They get hooked on the love. They don't get hooked on the abuse. I've never met one woman in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that I've evaluated who was not concerned about the violence. They're all concerned about the violence, but they go for the love.
So in your experience with these dynamics that you've described, does the victim ever yell at her partner?
Absolutely.
Why?
We know from the research that women use verbal and physical acts of aggression in these relationships. That's not uncommon. This has been researched for 5 decades. And a woman may yell at her partner because she's angry. And anger is a very normal emotion to having been abused. She can also be afraid, but they don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can absolutely, as human beings.
Oh, I see. So she's justifying Amber Heard's verbally abusive and angry behavior because she's claiming that Johnny was abusive.
He was going to hit her. And that's not true. That's just
Unfortunately,
happening.
honey, I in this case anyways, I'm hearing lots of testimony from multiple people of the lack of history of abusive behavior by Johnny Depp, whereas the prevalence of abusive, narcissistic tendencies and yelling and screaming and demanding of Amber Heard. So, honey, that is a shitty argument. Of course she would be angry. No, I'm sorry. I don't agree.
The risk of violence is there. So it doesn't mean that she's not afraid and that she's not concerned about the violence. And it doesn't mean she doesn't also use placating and compliance strategies most of the time as well.
Does in the cases that you have and in your experience, does the abuse typically take place in front of others?
No, I mean, this is classically what we talk about behind closed doors. Most of the intimate partner violence, the domestic violence, happens, you know, in the privacy of your own home. So sometimes we see the remnants of it, the after effects, or victims talk to their friends or family about it, but very rarely are you seeing it happen, the actual blow-up phase happen in the middle of witnesses and other people.
What does the term bystander effect mean?
So bystander effect means what happens when people are aware that domestic violence is happening? What happens when they're aware, even if they're not seeing it, that it could be happening? And what happens is we know that it's very difficult for people to stand up and say something. It's very difficult, especially in situations where there's a larger community of folks and the person who perhaps is perpetrating the abuse is the leader of that community. it becomes very difficult to go up against that, to go up against the sort of the head honcho of the community.
Subtle much?
People are very
Oh, yes.
fearful of losing their jobs.
I'm not,
I've
she's,
seen
I
this
don't know,
time and
honey.
time
Again, in the cases that I've worked on, either the Boy Scout cases or the clergy abuse cases, all of those type of cases where the USA Gymnastics, where when we go back and we look, we see people knew, but the secretary doesn't want to lose her job. She has kids to feed. The guy who, checks you in, he doesn't want to lose his job because he has a mortgage to pay. So people are quiet and they don't say anything. And then other people are very, it's a very worrisome dynamic. They don't want to put their foot out there if they're wrong, and maybe I didn't see it right.
Right, or I don't really know what
Yeah, I would
happened.
say this is
Certainly
equally
not gonna
true, though,
jeopardize
to
my
Amber
job.
Heard's friends that she would
If I
often
don't
gather
really know what
together,
happened behind
maybe
the
after an
or
argument, in
see
the situation of her texting a nurse with pictures at 1 a.m. to get some sort of a reaction, and some professional intervention for injuries that she's sending to someone in the middle of the night. So this is a very lopsided conversation. I think it really invalidates what she's saying, quite honestly.
Thank you. Did you finish your answer?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. What about mutual abuse? What is that? What role does that play?
So mutual abuse isn't really a term of art that we use. What we look at is situational couple violence and intimate partner violence. And when we look at situational couple violence, that really does characterize the majority of types of violence and abuse that happens in relationships. That's when a couple gets out of hand. They may push, shove, slap, yell, say some things that they don't want. And it's not that those behaviors are okay, but those are sort of what our larger scale community-based studies say happens in these relationships. That's distinguished from intimate partner violence, what I'm talking to you about, that has this constellation of symptoms and is rooted in the abuse of power and control.
Is there research that addresses this mutual abuse?
Yeah, there's research that addresses what does gender symmetry look like, male and female. Are they the same? And there's certainly, as I said, research that on the lower end types of violent behaviors, push, shove, slap, we may see similar rates between men and women. In psychological aggression, yelling, name calling, putting down, in some of our big community scale studies, we may see similar rates of perpetration in those
We
behaviors.
may? Yeah,
but
no,
then
we
there
do.
are,
Other situations where we don't have gender symmetry, and what the research talks about very clearly is you have to examine context. You have to examine the differential of power and control and coercive control in the relationship to make a full determination.
Do women use violence in relationships?
Yeah, absolutely.
and we've known this for 5 decades in
Of
our
course
research.
they
We've been
do.
Studying this.
Of course
since
they
the
do, honey.
70s.
And when we look at what happens, women do report their use of violence. The majority of violence that we do see is what we call
It's
reactive
super
violence
underreported,
or
though, honey.
self-defensive
It's
act
extremely
violence
underreported.
or
How
some
hard
kind of
is
violence
it?
that's
How hard was it
perpetrated
for Johnny Depp to do this
of an assault or
defamation
something that's
case,
going on.
right?
But
It
mostly
is
that when the partner
extremely
begins to become
underreported.
violent,
There
then
are
she
so
becomes
many
violent.
women that are,
And that's not
sorry
an
about that, guys.
uncommon dynamic, that if
There are
somebody
so
is
many
being
abusive women out there that
pushed
get
or
away with
that
it
a person would
for their
find
whole
that
lives.
been
been
established.
Men are extremely embarrassed and shamed
And
to
what
talk
about
about it or
behaviors
to
that
admit it,
have
or even
changing
to
power dynamics
the
and
fact that they
structure?
wouldn't most
Well,
of
you
the
have
time
to
be
find out,
believed.
does
So
her use of
I think this is a
violence
very
change the overarching
good
power structure of
example
coercive
of a
control
public figure that
and
has had the
violence
balls
in relationships?
to
And you have to
actually
examine those variables to
put
see
this out
does it
public,
or does it not?
in hopes
Can
that,
men be victims
well,
of
I think it can be very helpful, honestly,
Absolutely.
on that side of, to
Certainly
equal out the
we know
conversation,
that
because
we have
even
to
this
be
lady who is
careful of
supposed to be
gender
up on
stereotypes. We can't
current
go in and
statistics
think,
and
oh,
works in
only
the
woman
field,
is the
like, I'm sorry,
victim,
just because
or
you work
only
in the
man
field
is the
doesn't mean you don't have
perpetrator.
gender
That
bias, and this
just
is
doesn't comport with
extremely
the research. We
a
know
poor,
that, the research
a
also
poor
shows that we can have
representation
domestic
of
violence in same-sex
gender bias.
relationships. My very first case was a same-sex domestic violence homicide in Brooklyn. So that was in 1998. So I've been examining and treating individuals in a variety of
Good
types
for
of
you.
violent
One
contexts.
case.
So we
Sorry.
have to be careful that that
Your
bias
language
doesn't
is
get in
very
our way
telling. You've
when
been
we're
just
evaluating
using the
particular
woman as the victim
situation
throughout
or
your
particular
entire
case.
dialogue here, honey.
That said, we do know that there still are differences. You know, in a heterosexual couple, in a male-female dyad, the research still is clear that there are differences. Men still perpetrate more severe acts of violence. Women are still more likely to be injured. They are much more likely to suffer, much more likely to be killed. So we know that those differences exist, but we do examine, you know, in those individual circumstances, knowing that either one could be a perpetrator or a victim.
So how are you able to determine whether a relationship is a situational violence or intimate partner violence?
So I thoroughly examine all of those
other variables.
There
look
is no
for
set
the
answer for these
coercive
questions.
control.
It's
Who
not,
holds the
it's
power in
not
the
qualitative.
situation? Who is
It's,
able to
it's,
say no? Who makes the decision?
honey,
What
it's
are the
just,
consequences
yeah.
if you
I love how
don't
they're trying to
follow
make these
the
concrete
decision of
answers.
your
It's not
partner?
possible,
Is
honey.
there
Sorry.
sexual violence? Is there intimidation and fear? Are there statistical factors that are associated with severe and lethal domestic violence? So there's a lot of data that we have in the field that we can use to assess a particular relationship and really find out what's going on.
Does alcohol and substance use cause people to be violent?
No, it certainly doesn't cause people to be violent. We have plenty of people who can be, you know, struggling with substance abuse and addiction, and they're not violent. But when you have a substance abuse and addiction, and you perpetrate domestic violence, it does create know that also from the research, the physical violence goes up. So a lot of the times when he's physically violent is when he's been consuming
I'm
drugs
sure
or
they were,
alcohol.
if they were both
When
being
you're not
abused
consuming
in this
drugs or
we're
alcohol,
discussing,
those
I'm
other
sure they were
behaviors
both
continue to
more.
the coercive control, the surveillance, the obsessive jealousy, the possessiveness, the psychological abuse. Those usually persist, but the alcohol can just throw lighter fluid on a flame in a situation of domestic violence.
Is there research that looks at how women cope with the violence and abuse in their relationships?
Yes, there is.
Please tell me about it. What does it say?
So there's been a lot of research to talk about what do women do. That's the question that everyone wants to know. Why doesn't she just leave? And in asking that question, why doesn't she just leave?
Honey,
We
why
ask
doesn't he
her
just
to say,
leave?
well,
Don't
let me tell you
forget
what
he
she does
too.
do.
And those women do a lot of things in that relationship. So sort of three main categories. One of the formal responses, the formal things that she does. Call the police, participate in prosecution of your partner, go see a therapist, go to a shelter, go to a hospital. These are sort of the very formal strategies that women, best friend, talking with your mom, talking with your friends, trying to get that emotional support from your social network. But the most common one is these personal strategies. And the personal strategies are really talking with your partner. They're trying to fix the relationship from within the confines of relationship counseling. Try to get him to go to or harm reduction model to help with his addiction, compliance with his demands, anticipating his demands, all these coping strategies that are sort of, you know, within that intimate relationship.
Let's talk about the calling the police. Is that a common response?
It's not a common response. Many women do not want to call the police on their partners. You know, using criminal justice interventions in crimes of women and children are the least likely to be called. And most of the time when the police are called, it's because a particular incident has got out of hand and she feels unsafe. And the only way
That she feels I can get this
I do
incident
agree.
to end
I mean,
and stop.
the body
by
difference
calling
of a man and a
law
woman
enforcement.
is significant. I agree with that, but this is,
typically.
I mean, this has
Not-
been a
problem and a difficulty for prosecutors across the country. Since I've been doing this work, I'm actually frequently called by the prosecutor to testify about a fact pattern because the victim won't come in and testify. So dropping restraining orders, not participating in the prosecution, violence.
domestic violence.
And what we know,
And what we know, and what we know from our law enforcement data and colleagues is that when you get that 911 call, they're very specifically trained to say, that's likely not the first episode.
The chances are have been on. That's why a thorough assessment is supposed to be done when police officers arrive on the scene. So usually that episode that calls the police is just meant to stop that incident in that moment, to get a sense of safety. Women don't want to participate.
Why women in violent relationships stay in the relationship when the man's hurting them?
I mean, they stay for all the reasons we talked about in the cycle of violence.
They stay for the loving man.
They
stay for the
both
man's
they
time.
both
They
stay
for
for the
man
same
that they decide to
reasons,
marry and had hope and
especially if they come from abusive families of
There's a lot
origin, and both of
love
them
and
did.
attachment is why they're connected to their partner. Some people stay because they have economic reasons and they don't have tangible resources to leave. Some people have children in common and they don't want to deprive their children of a father. So some people fear retaliation. If I leave, I'm going to get serious. Frankly, the statistics bear it out. The most dangerous time for a woman is when she's leaving that relationship. Her likelihood of being killed grows substantially at that moment. So leaving sometimes isn't a best strategy. Staying keeps her safe. So there's usually a whole multitude of factors of why a woman decides to stay in a relationship. And again, as I said previously, it doesn't mean she's unconcerned about the violence. It's just she hasn't figured out a way out yet.
What, if any, role does emotional attachment and love play in that?
That's probably the biggest.
Okay, I'm just going to take a little break here and dip out because I'm really having a hard time to this waitress. The reason she's irritating is because she's portraying, painting a picture of women as the only people that can be victims of domestic violence. Hopefully the jury is not falling for it, as there's been multiple examples of equally abusive behavior. I haven't heard a lot of abusive behavior by Johnny Depp in this case up until now, but I've heard a lot of evidence of consistent abusive behavior by Amber Heard. So I'm going to dip out for a few minutes because this lady is really, really old school gender bias, and I'll be back. I'll just keep it recording though, so you can keep watching if you want to.
Now, you mentioned lethality a little earlier. Can you please explain to us what that means?
So lethality is means death, means fatality, and we have very well validated instruments and data that looks at what factors happen in a relationship where a woman ends up dead. And we do that through looking retrospectively, saying, here's, this person ended up dead, killed by her partner in a homicide, and let's see what factors were there so that we can work at preventing it. It's very methodologically sound over different case control designs over multiple cities, used by the FBI and law enforcement. So these are a number of factors that tell us that somebody is in a very dangerous situation. So some of the factors are an increase of frequency and severity of the violence, threats to kill, choking behavior, sexual assault, obsessive and possessive jealousy, controlling behavior, the perpetrator's use and abuse of substances, alcohol and substances, the perpetrator's threatening of suicide himself, right? Those are some of the top factors, and there are more that are very, very dangerous. When we hear that and we hear a woman is in a situation where those are present, then we are moving out of situational couple violence.
What, if any, role does destroying property?
And destroying property, destruction of property, personal property is also one of the risk factors for danger and fatality.
And what, if any, role does leaving threatening messages play?
Yep. That's also a risk factor for lethality.
What are the psychological and traumatic effects that such interpersonal violence has on victims?
Objection compound.
Psychological and traumatic effects are kind of interchangeable.
I'll sustain the objection.
What are the psychological effects that such interpersonal violence has on victims?
So these have also been well-researched, and they are wide and varied. We see depression and depressive disorders, sometimes with suicidality. We see anxiety and anxiety disorders, a lot of stress. We see post-traumatic stress disorder. We see substance abuse and substance abuse disorders. We see trust difficulties and difficulties in interpersonal relationships. As a result, we see a lot of shame and humiliation. We see
Yeah, hi, I'm back. I just wanted to weigh in on this conversation that is deeply gender biased and is going to get paused for that reason. If you want to keep watching it, feel free to find another stream that is clearly doing the live trial right now in the afternoon here. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on a few observations as a therapist in the same field as this woman. I'm not a psychologist, I'm a psychotherapist, but I've been dealing with people in the field counseling for 17 years. I think that it is true. She was just touching on the shame piece about how there's shame to admitting people might be in a potentially abusive situation or a relationship, long-term or short-term. And she was just starting to, the Heard side's lawyer was just starting to lead into the questioning about what are the consequences of being in an abusive relationship, and just kind of her starting to spout of post-traumatic stress, anxiety disorders, et cetera, and shame. And so I guess to balance out the conversation a little bit, I think there's shame on both sides. If a woman is abusing a man, there's equal, actually probably more shame. And I'm not, like I said, I wasn't in their home. I wasn't in their relationship. So only them and God above knows what truly happened in their relationship and how abusive it was, whether it was mutually abusive, more, whatever, back and forth abusive, who knows? Actually, nobody can really completely 100% quantify what happened in this relationship. Bottom line, it's toxic. It was going downhill, uphill, downhill, all around, and it was potentially physically and emotionally dangerous for both of them. So I am very, very, very thankful that they both got out of the relationship, regardless of who technically filed for divorce. That was mentioned yesterday, that Amber Heard did that. That doesn't mean anything to me. I think I do think of, I was going to talk about the shame, but I was going to say also just that I remember in Johnny Depp, when he was testifying, one of the things that he said was that he wanted out. They had audio of him throwing the wedding ring on the floor and her not letting him leave after that. But also that he said that he wanted out because if he didn't get out, then something about it will end. If I don't end it, or if we don't end it, it will end us, or something like that. And that's exactly what this woman, in a not very sophisticated or accurate way, is just trying to describe to the court, that it is true. If you stay in a relationship that is like this, where both parties have childhood abuse trauma, which we've heard that they both do, and we might hear more about Amber's side if the case continues, because I haven't had a chance to look because of work and stuff, but I thought I heard that Amber was trying to get the case thrown out. So anyways, if you have that and you have a couple that is not willing to kind of maybe even separate temporarily to try and get some help for each other's issues on both sides, in order to have a more stable relationship, then it exactly what Mr. Depp said very eloquently is that it will end you, and meaning that it can end up in suicide, it can end up in homicide, it can end up in accidental suicide, homicide, it can end up in somebody getting committed to a psychiatric hospital. It can end in so many different horrible ways. So my hat goes off to both of them for ending this relationship, and it's very obvious as to why it needed to end. And it's unfortunate, very unfortunate, but also good in a way, or in a big way, because it was not a good mix. So I can see too, though, that I will say in the power differentiation piece, I mean, when you're married to someone that's a celebrity and that has a security detail and is their job is to protect Johnny Depp, and then you're there as the wife and you don't have the same detail of security. I mean, that could be very intimidating. And that is a very valid line of thought, that would be really hard, especially if there was violence going on in the relationship, to be able to feel, like there was equal representation of what was going on. And so, yeah, in order to kind of balance it out, I would say both of them could have left, and both of them, like this woman is saying, it's hard to leave even if you know that there's things that are wrong or toxic in your relationship. And also there's a lot of shame in admitting it, and even admitting it to yourself, let alone other people in the world. Because there's a lot of shame. There's a lot of embarrassment. So just keep that in mind if you're watching this lady. I don't choose to watch her anymore because I don't think that her opinions they're not equal for both genders. I think she's painting a very lopsided picture. But I think there was a lot of shame for Mr. Depp in the situation too, that admitting that things weren't working out, and also obviously getting super triggered by this woman that was very abusive to him in the similar way that his mother was, that was very mentally unstable. From what I've heard from the case, and I'm not going to say any opinions unless I actually saw that day and saw that testimony, but from what I heard in the case is that Johnny Depp's mother was extremely emotionally unstable and had mental illness. And it sounds like, from the psychologist's point of view and diagnoses, that Amber Heard has several personality disorders diagnosed by a licensed psychologist, not this woman. So very similar. So it makes a lot of sense, not even just for Amber's sake, but that he wouldn't leave because it was like he would be leaving his mom. Kind of weird, I know. But anyways, enjoy.
The anger and rage, a whole sleep disruption, a whole host of
3 steps to getting a girlfriend. Step 1, throw out your old body wash.
Your balls smell really bad.
Wait, my balls smell bad?
Yes.
Most
Sorry, guys. All right, perfect timing. Break time. Enjoy.
Thank you, Your Honor. I can only
Okay, I'm
assume
just
that
gonna
Mr. Chu wrote that speech
add
for
here
audience
this
outside the
motion to
court because it
dismiss
didn't
that I missed
really address
earlier
my
here.
arguments. I'm going to focus on
See
what our
here.
specific arguments are for the motion to strike, Your Honor. Mr. Chu spent almost 30 minutes of the court's time talking about the disputed evidence of physical abuse in this case, which Ms. Hurd hasn't even put on her case. And I can tell you she's not the abuser. And if the case moves forward, she and her witnesses will put on even more evidence of the physical abuse she suffered at the hands of Mr. Depp. But that's not the basis for our motion right now, Your
Okay,
Honor.
buddy.
He talks about how Mr. Depp had a sworn denial. And that should count. We read his testimony. He claims he didn't strike her. But again, that's not the basis for our motion. The basis for our motion is the clear and undisputed evidence of non-physical abuse.
By his definitions, by his standards, by the standards of his expert, there is no dispute that Mr. Depp abused Amber. And therefore, if he did it even one time, no dispute that even under their theory of the case, the implication that they want the jury to draw from the article, which again, I'm not arguing for the purposes of today, because under the legal standard, I'm not going to argue that. I'm not going to waste the court's time with that. But even under their standard, the undisputed evidence is that Mr. Depp did commit abuse against Ms. Hurd, and therefore that those first two statements were false. That's our argument on that. As to the headline, it's funny, Mr. Chu, we played 2 or 3 hours of an ACLU deposition. Now he says, well, that wasn't our witness. It was his witness, Your Honor. He just spent 10 minutes talking about what Mr. Doherty said, and Mr. Doherty testified that the Washington Post wrote the headline. That is the only evidence, Your Honor. I understand he says, well, Exhibit 1 has her name on it. Exhibit 1 has her name on it. But the only evidence in this case about who wrote that headline is Mr. Doherty's testimony. It is undisputed. They could have put anyone else on. They could have called Ms. Hurd for that because that was not part of the stipulation at the pretrial conference. It was only the tweet that we talked about, Your Honor, and they chose not to do that. Now, Ms. Hurd will testify she didn't write that headline, so it wouldn't have helped them. But they've had 3 weeks to put on their case, Your Honor. They've controlled the playing field of evidence. There is no dispute that Ms. Hurd did not write that headline. No dispute. Simply saying, well, her name is attached to it, that can't overcome the testimony of the ACLU. They call them a co-conspirator. Of course, Mr. Depp chose not to sue them. But the testimony of Terrence Doherty that she didn't write that headline, that takes care of the sexual violence headline, Your Honor. And I'm not going to take up any more of the court's time addressing portions of Mr. Depp or Mr. Chu's argument that don't go
I'm a little
to
confused
our
here.
motion, unless Your Honor has any specific questions. But I want to be respectful.
All right, thank you, sir. All right. For this motion, I've taken the arguments of counsel, and last night I reviewed all of the evidence that has been submitted in this matter. So as to the second and third alleged defamatory statements, at the motion to strike at this juncture, I view the evidence in the light most favorable to the plaintiff and reasonable inferences from the evidence to the plaintiff. And if there is a scintilla of evidence that a reasonable juror could weigh, then the matter survives a motion to strike. In this matter, there is evidence in the case that a jury could weigh that the statements were made by the defendant, that the statements were about the plaintiff, that the statement was published, that the statement is false, and the defendant made the statement knowing it to be false, or the defendant made it so recklessly as to amount to willful disregard for the truth. The weight of that evidence is up to the fact finder. So the motion to strike is denied as to statement 2 and 3.
Yes.
The motion to strike as to statement 1, I'm going to take under advisement because if it's not a stipulation, I'm not sure what it is, but there seems to be an agreement that the tweet of Ms. Hurd is part of the plaintiff's evidence, which is not in evidence at this point. So I can't rule on that statement whether or not it is just a tweet or if it's some sort of republication or something. I don't know because I haven't seen it yet. So as to the motion to strike on statement 1, I'm going to take an advisement because ruling on it now, it would be premature because I just don't have that evidence in the case, okay?
Thank you very much, Your Honor.
All right. Since it's 12:30, you want to just take lunch?
Innovative, cutting-edge casino technology. LeoVegas.
Okay, so there you have it. Motion to strike denied. So it sounds like there was some sort of a tweet. I don't know the whole story, but I wanted to just see if anybody on here did, but it sounds like that motion has been denied. So I'm sure I just find it hard. I mean, I think it's hard with technology and these different platforms, social media platforms. It's not always easy to prove who posted what. So it sounds like it's not going to hold weight to actually drop this case. So it will be interesting to see going forward when Ms. Heard will be put on the stand, which I'm assuming she will at some point, and we'll check back with you then. I'm not sure what else they're doing today, but peace out.